Welcome to everybody who has tuned into this video. I'm here with author, mother, PhD. You're a PhD, is that correct, Kerry McDonald?
Just a master's.
Oh, just a master's. I think that's still distinguished, and we're so lucky and blessed to have you here with us. We're talking with you because you are the author of Unschooled, which is a new book about unschooling, and I want to talk to you about that and the idea of unschooling generally. But first, can we get you to tell everybody a little bit about yourself, why you're passionate about unschooling, and just kind of why you've pursued this book and this path?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here with you, Dustin. Looking forward to chatting about unschooling and education freedom more broadly. I am the Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org, which is the country's oldest free market think tank. And I'm also an education policy writer, and my new book, Unschooled, just was published last week by Chicago Review Press. I became interested in homeschooling and unschooling really back when I was an undergraduate in college. I was an economics major as an undergraduate, but I became increasingly interested in education, particularly from that kind of economic mindset of thinking something wasn't quite right with this monopoly system of government schooling that was so pervasive and that I felt really limited parental choice. So I became more interested in looking at alternative education and alternatives to school. And my senior year of college, I had a classmate who had a family member that lived nearby who was homeschooling. And I didn't know anything about homeschooling. I went to K-12 public schools. Never knew a homeschooler. This was the late 1990s. Homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all 50 states just a few years prior by 1993. So it was still a relatively new phenomenon, not quite hit the mainstream the way it has today. And I remember just being so enchanted by this homeschooling family when I walked into their kitchen for the first time and seeing this sort of authentic learning that was happening and this true, genuine immersion into the people, places, and things of their community. And that was really in stark contrast to that same semester when I was doing a student teaching practicum in a local public elementary school and saw sort of this conventional classroom that really was focused around command and control and, raise your hand for permission to use the bathroom and don't talk to the person next to you because socializing is for after school and all of that. And so those two contrasting images really stuck with me, and that was what ultimately prompted me to go to graduate school in education policy at Harvard, and continued my sort of passion for alternatives to school and education choice more generally.
So thank you for that. So let's start at the foundational level. What is unschooling? I think there's a lot of confusion about that term. So what is it? Is it different from I mean, I know because I've read the book, but is it different from homeschooling? How is it different? Kind of give me the rundown on that concept.
Right. So I use unschooling as a catch-all term for really disentangling education from schooling. And, for most of sort of human history, education was really considered a broad and general term that wasn't confined to a school classroom. If you think about kind of prior to the 19th century, in this country, there was an assortment of education options. There were a host of private schools and public schools, charity schools and church schools, a vibrant apprenticeship program, sort of expectation for apprenticeships and sort of this alternative pathway to adulthood. You had dame schools, which were these sort of nursery schools in your neighbor's kitchen. So education was this really broad and varied good that was sort of valued from the colonial era up until the 19th century. And in the 19th century, that was when Massachusetts, my home state, passed the country's first compulsory schooling statute in 1852. And at that time, now what was this sort of public good, this sort of largely broad topic, really became confined to compulsory school classrooms, and parents were required under a legal threat of force to send their children to school. So I think what I try to do in Unschooled is really kind of trace this history from education freedom to force through compulsory schooling, and now sort of back to freedom. And I think we've seen some of that freedom, that pathway to freedom, beginning with the inception of the modern homeschooling movement that dates back to around the 1970s. And it was John Holt, who was one of the leaders of the modern homeschooling movement, who in 1977 coined the term unschooling, which he defined as parents taking their children out of school. And he was one of the key figures back in the 1970s to help parents to do that. This was before homeschooling was legal, when parents were being persecuted for taking charge of their child's education. And so Holt and others were really integral figures in helping to make sure that compulsory schooling laws were changed or interpreted properly to allow parents to have this right to educate their children.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that history and that backstory. It's amazing to me that and because I'm a millennial, like, and I grew up in an era where school choice was always legal. And it's interesting to me that parents educating their kids on their own and taking that initiative was ever illegal. It baffles me. I don't get it. But
and the first charter school, didn't come on the scene until the 1990s.
Right.
And even though Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, sort of popularized the idea of vouchers in the mid 20th century, that's a concept that really has only taken off in the past couple of decades. So these are, I think the time is right, not only because of, we're seeing sort of these trend setters in terms of homeschooling and really parents taking charge of their child's education, but I think that's also there's also this larger momentum around parental choice in education that connects to these other topics as well.
Well, let's talk. I have like a bajillion questions for you, but I want to focus on that momentum. It seems like, this is a growing spark, and people are taking more interest in homeschooling and unschooling and other charters or other alternatives. What do you think is fueling that momentum? Is it dissatisfaction with the school system? Is it just, paying attention to kids' needs? Like what is going on there? I'm incredibly curious about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's both. I think a lot of people don't realize how much more standardized and test-driven schooling has become, and how much more all-consuming of childhood it is now than it has ever been. So even though, some of us may have gone through this public school system years ago, we think, well, we made it through and it's fine. And I think what we don't appreciate is that, this kind of push towards nationalized curriculum frameworks and periodic standardized testing and longer time in school and school-like settings has really only taken off since the early 2000s. No Child Left Behind was passed in 2001. And then through those sort of the past 18 years has really been ramped up with continued reauthorization and push towards standardized testing. And now kids are spending much more time in school and school-like settings than they ever did before.
Right.
So I think because of that, parents are getting glimpses here and there that things aren't quite right, and they're not like how they used to be, and they're searching for alternatives. And homeschooling and unschooling and these other education choice options become appealing choices.
I have a I have a 7-year-old and a daughter who's about to be 5. I love them to death, and one of them's in a charter school. The next one's going to be in a charter school in September. And I find it interesting because there's this push in Idaho going on right now for K-12, or excuse me, pre-K standard across all districts, everywhere, full day, all the time. And the advocates say something like, well, we need to have these kids ready for kindergarten. I'm like, wait a second, ready for kindergarten? That's where they learn. I mean, if you're not doing your stuff at home, that's where they learn their letters. That's where they learn to finger paint. Like, what do they need to be ready for? What is it with this? I guess I don't understand the push to have kids in school from like age 2.5 or 3 or 4 all the way till, they're 20, 25 or whatever. What is, can you help me understand why people think that we need to have 4-year-olds in school all day?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. I think at the practical level, a lot of young children are in preschool anyway. And so, sort of, there's this feeling that wouldn't it be nice if it were taxpayer funded so that we don't have to pay out of pocket for it. So, there's that piece certainly going on nationally, and I think is causing a lot of the push towards early universal preschool and early child enrollment in school. I think the standardized testing is also a big piece that, even if early childhood teachers themselves know that it's not great to be pushing these kind of early literacy skills or expecting young children to read at such young ages, they feel pressure because the kids will have to be taking standardized testing really soon and early in elementary school. So I think they're caught up in that process now. One of my probably the most popular article that I have written for the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org, is actually the most popular article ever on fee.org about the dangers of early school enrollment. It has had over 1 million page views. And I think it's because it really struck a chord with parents and educators who realized that this trend isn't healthy for children. And I cite data from a Harvard study last fall in November, where Harvard researchers found that in states with a September 1st age enrollment cutoff for kindergarten, if there were kids that had just turned 5 in August, so sort of these newly minted 5-year-olds that were entering kindergarten on September 1st, those kids were 30% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, than kids who were about to turn 6 in September.
Wow.
And so one of the things I say in my article is parents know this. We know that a year makes a tremendous difference in terms of child's development in early childhood. And I think that there are these signals so that even though parents are feeling pressure to enroll their children in these kind of rigorous academic early learning environments, they're also getting these signals here and there that, maybe this isn't all quite right and I should trust my instincts a little bit more in terms of my child's early development.
Right. I want to key in and move back toward unschooling and the idea of trust. It seems like unschooling is a lot about trusting your kids to follow their interests and their instincts. Now, I have to tell you, back to my kids, I have a 7-year-old who, if he could, he would read Pokemon all day. All day. So as a parent, that gives me pause because I know that he's reading, but I don't know if he's reading the right stuff. So how is it that, and it does say something about me that I don't trust my kid necessarily to follow his passion. So talk to me about unschooling and trust and self-directed education and how parents can foster that growth that you talk about in your book.
Well, I think it is about trust. It's about trusting children and trusting parents to know what's right for their children. And I in the book I trace these ideas around self-directed education and sort of self-ownership and non-coercion back to the Enlightenment era and John Locke as sort of this preeminent Enlightenment philosopher who was the first to talk really about individual liberty and tolerance and freedom from coercion. And he talked in 1693 in his treatise, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, about how we shouldn't be kind of dragging children unwillingly to their lessons and sort of the dangers of force in education. And one of the things that John Locke says, not in the 1693 treatise, but elsewhere, he says it's one thing to persuade, it is another to command. And I think that's really the difference. If we look about kind of freedom in education over force, this doesn't mean that you just have to sit around and let your son read Pokemon all day. Although I would argue that if you were to, he would probably develop some really great reading skills because he's reading what he loves to do and so on. And I'm sure you would provide that ample time. But it doesn't have to be the only thing, and that the adult's role and the community's role in facilitating self-directed education is to make sure that we're surrounding young people with all kinds of opportunities and resources so that they're still able to pursue their passions and to soak up hours of reading Pokemon, but there's other things that they'll be exposed to as well. And that's really, a vital role for adult facilitators who are working in self-directed education learning spaces or in your home.
Right. It's interesting. You talk about in one of the first chapters, you talk about how kids are naturally curious. Um, and I was driving my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, somewhere last night, and she asked me questions about how cars work, how the sky works, how all this, like, I answered questions for 30 minutes straight last night, which was it was awesome. But you talk in the book about how sometimes public schools can make kids uncurious and kind of
Right.
hammer that away from them and distance themselves from that curiosity. Can you talk about how that happens and how we as parents can recapture that?
Right. So if we think about what our system of compulsory mass schooling is based on, it's based on the Prussian model of education. And Prussia was this sort of vast expanse of land that is now takes up much of modern day Germany. And it was where Horace Mann, who's considered sort of the father of American public education, he was the first president of the board of secretary of the Board of Education in Massachusetts, and was instrumental in passing that first compulsory schooling statute in the state in 1852 that was then replicated nationwide. And he became enchanted with the Prussian model, this focus on order and organization and conformity and compliance. And so it's no surprise that when he encouraged leaders in the U.S. to import that model here, that we would still have a system that would focus on sort of rote learning and organization and just age segregated classrooms with sort of the same static handful of teachers who were standardized in their own training, because that was a big key factor for Horace Mann, is standardizing not only the children but the teachers and making sure that everything was really centralized. So we still have that model. The model hasn't really changed that much in a little over 160 years. So, of course, you take these children who are naturally exuberant, who learn a tremendous amount of concepts and knowledge in those first few years of their life, and then we send them off to school at age 4, 5, or 6. And for some reason, think that at that age, this sort of natural learning tendency stops, and now they have to be taught, even though they've done all of these incredible things up until that point. And what
Right.
happens is then all of us become conditioned to be taught in order to learn. And so we
Right.
lose a lot of those self-directed drives for learning. And it takes many of us, until we get out of school to sort of reconnect with
Yeah.
our own curiosity and our own capacity for learning. And I think one of the things I talk about in the book, and that's so critical, and why I think this is sort of a moment for unschooling and self-directed education, is thankfully we have the platform to make this happen now with technology. It used to be that you went to school because that was where the books were, that was where the
Right.
teachers were, that was where the knowledge was. Now that's at our fingertips, and anything that we want to learn, we have the capacity to learn that way. And in fact, that's how most of us, if we need to learn something new, we go on YouTube and figure it out. And so we
Yep.
already kind of already see what it means now with technology to be self-directed learners. And I think the key is just to recognize the power of that and then to grant that gift to our children.
So the next question is kind of there's a lot here, and it's going to take a second to unpack. Um, First of all, what stops parents from going the unschooling route? Second, um, what can this work for? There are a lot of families that they're working families. Mom has a job, dad has a job, and they don't have a lot of time to spend with their kids. So I think that's why they send them to public schools, quite frankly, is they just need a place for the kid to go that the kid won't, I don't know, die. Um, so can that work for working families? And how do we not push, but because that we don't want to coerce people, how do we persuade people that unschooling is the right option for kids these days? Again, I know there's a lot there, so go
Right,
go
right.
ahead.
Okay, so I think there's really 3 points. And the first point relates to, what is stopping people from moving to unschooling. And I would suggest that more people are moving toward unschooling. So unschooling as this, again, catch-all term for disentangling education from schooling, including school-at-home versions of homeschooling. where, you may be rejecting a class or conventional classroom, but you're still importing that schooled mindset and those sort of schooled expectations into the home. More families are in the homeschooling space moving away from that. So in fact, the most recent federal data on homeschoolers found that in 2012, about 13% of the respondents of this national household survey that captures homeschooling data, they found that 13% of homeschooling families took an informal approach to learning. That was sort of their approach to homeschooling. Just 4 years later, in 2016, that number had jumped up to 20%. And so I think already you see, even within the homeschooling community, families acknowledging, hey, we've left school. Why are we trying to replicate this in our home? And let's really have a much more self-directed, more informal learning process here that gives our kids a lot more freedom. So you're see that within the homeschooling community. And then I think your second point is, how do we make this more accessible to more families? And that's where I talk a lot in the book about self-directed learning centers and unschooling schools and other alternatives to school that are really sprouting across the country and, in fact, the world, that are trying, to make this option more accessible to more families, to working parent families, single parent families, who really gravitate to these ideas, but might feel like they can't devote their time to kind of full-time homeschooling. And so these are hybrid homeschooling models that in many cases allow children to attend anywhere from a day a week up to 5 days a week. So it really can be much more flexible and focused along the child's needs and the family's circumstances. Because in many of these cases, you're registered as a homeschooler. So homeschooling becomes that legal mechanism to bypass compulsory schooling laws and allow parents to take back control of their child's education with much more freedom and flexibility. So that's one thing. I will also say that these self-directed learning centers and unschooling schools are usually a third of the cost of a typical private school. So they really are generally affordable, but still, you're right, still prohibitively expensive for other families. And that's sort of the second piece of your second question or your second comment, which is why I really advocate in a lot of my writings at fee.org for education choice. And how do we expand education choice? Right now, we have a K-12 public school system that taxpayers are spending $700 billion every year on, with questionable results. And so if we can encourage some more education innovation through education choice mechanisms, then I think we'll be able to provide a lot more accessibility and opportunity for families. And then the final piece, I think, that you were saying is, why now? Why is self-directed education, or I would argue education innovation more broadly, more important right now? And I think, frankly, it's because of the kind of innovation era that we're in. We have an industrial age system of schooling right now that educates almost 90% of students. And yet we have an innovation era that's entirely different from the sort of 19th century factory model of schooling. So one of the things I talk about a lot in the book and elsewhere is this idea that we're competing or coexisting more often with robots. Right. And yet our school system is still stuck in this process of kind of training people to be robots, to do what they're told and stay in line and follow directions and then produce. And really, robots are doing that. So we have to look at what are those essential human qualities that distinguish us from robots. And really, those are qualities like creativity and curiosity and ingenuity and an entrepreneurial spirit that the robots haven't quite caught up to us on yet.
Thank goodness.
I don't, yes. So I don't think that we have to create curriculum or schools to teach creativity and curiosity and ingenuity. I think we just need to stop crushing those qualities out of young children. As you know, with your 5 and 7-year-old and their incessant questioning and curiosity, it's already there. We just have to let that continue. And then we will be able to see tremendous human flourishing and innovation like we've never seen before.
Right. So we took questions from IFF supporters, and thank you for unpacking that very large question. We took questions from IFF supporters, and they were curious about unschooling and the concept. And here's one that again I think gives parents pause. This was from Danielle. She says, "I love the idea of unschooling, but is it really realistic? It seems like you need school and unschool, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. My kids thrive with structure, so having what seems to be a free for all, which I think is one of the big criticisms of, and it probably is unfounded, a free for all seems a bit over the top, and I just can't wrap my head around that. So, is unschooling a free for all? And is it just because, I went through, like you, I went through K-12 schools, I went through college, and that's what I'm comfortable with. And I think that's been etched into our souls, quite frankly, is that we need that structure. How can we go to a free for all system? Uh, and I guess, um, how do we square that to go to from this structured system that we're all comfortable with but may not be effective to the free for all system that might be more effective, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I would first stop. I appreciate Danielle for her question. I think the sort of stereotype of unschooling is that it is a free for all, but the first thing I would say is it's absolutely not a free for all. That self-directed education is not just children running wild. It is not the Lord of the Flies. In fact, I have an article about this on fee.org. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's facilitated by adults. I mean, don't forget, Lord of the Flies. There's just a bunch of kids on an island. There's supported adults and community members, and this can either happen in your homes as a variation of homeschooling, or what's increasingly happening is self-directed education and unschooling are being supported in these self-directed learning centers and innovative unschooling schools. So it's definitely not a free-for-all. One of the main themes throughout the Unschooled book is how different families, individuals, and organizations balance freedom with responsibility. So you have to have, if you're focused on individual freedom, which I certainly am, certainly right about, you have to balance that with personal responsibility and
Right.
responsibility to your community and to your family and so on. And so, that's what I think was most interesting in the book, is looking at the different ways that different families and organizations negotiate that. One of the early educators that I quote in the book, and that was certainly a central figure for the rise of the modern unschooling movement, is a man named A.S. Neal, who wrote the book Summerhill in 1960, that cataloged his first 40 years in running the Summerhill School, which is a self-directed school in England that was founded in 1921 and still in existence today.
Right.
And in Summerhill, and in his later book, Freedom Not License, A.S. Neal really focuses on this concept of freedom and responsibility, and basically says you need to, without that, you can't have freedom turn into license or permissiveness, because then your freedom impacts my freedom and nobody gets anything done. And this
Right.
isn't, it wouldn't be good for anybody. So we talk a lot in the book about freedom and responsibility and freedom not license. And then I think the larger piece of this is that parents, I would argue, whether you're a homeschooling parent or a parent of children in school, you have the responsibility to ensure that your children are highly literate and highly numerate. That's your parent responsibility. And I think there are ways that you can do that, again, through supporting their interests and persuading and guiding them without force.
So we're gonna get you out of here. We got just two more minutes, two more questions. Actually, my questions take long; they take minutes. So,
No
um,
problem. Yeah, it's fine.
I read "Educated" by Tara Westover before I read your book, and it
Yes,
was
excellent book.
interesting. Have you read it?
Yes, I love it.
It's fantastic.
Right.
Now, the question I have is, a lot of people on who are unschooling or homeschooling critics would say those parents, the Westovers, they weren't equipped to homeschool their kids, and in fact, they didn't. And they would use the Westovers as avatars for everybody else. Um, my question is, and I think a lot of parents worry too, that they're equipped to teach their kids. That I don't know, quite frankly, I don't know algebra. I don't care about algebra. I know math, some of it, and like I'm not going to teach my kids math. So are parents equipped to actually guide their kids' learning, or do we have to trust that the licensed professionals are, excuse me, my phone's going off, that they are the right people to guide our kids' learning or to instruct our kids, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I have a lot of faith in parents. I think parents want what's best for their children. And I think the vast majority of parents will seek the best education options for their children, particularly if we can make education options more widely available to them so that they're not just stuck with their assigned district school. So I don't know that that means that every parent or every family would want to homeschool, but I do think that parents have, a general desire for their children to succeed and to be happy. And again, I think that this is sort of a core parent tenet that the vast majority of parents share, and will do anything possible to make sure their children are happy and educated and fulfilled. And I think that I don't share your pessimism around parents. I think we need to give them many more options and many more choices,
Sure.
and enable them to make those choices and not have sort of government authorities making the choices for them. I think that that disempowers families. I just say one thing about Educated. It is a fantastic book. In a very sort of odd way, it's a testament, I suppose, to the power of self-directed education,
It really is.
but certainly not the kind of self-directed education that I'm advocating for. But they're a stereotype, and I think that you're always going to have kind of families on the fringe, but for the most part, families really do want what's best for their children, and whether they're homeschooling or sending their children to school, they just need access to more opportunities and resources and choices.
And I do think that you're right. Educated is, I mean, the kids, the Tara especially, she brought herself to school. She eventually got herself to a PhD, and it's
Right.
really amazing.
And is this
Despite
incredible writer?
right,
Right.
and despite all the odds and the terrible situation which she was
Yeah.
seemingly in, it really is a testament to one person's love for education. It's fantastic. So read that one and then read Unschooled.
Mhm.
Last question, actually two questions left. Um, if somebody wants to get started or explore unschooling, besides well, obviously they want to read your book, where else do they start? And then second question, we'll get out of here. Where do people pick up your book?
Right. So definitely, grab my book, Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. It's available now wherever books are sold. It should be in your local bookstore. It's on Amazon and on other online book retailers. So grab it there. You can also visit my website, which is wholefamilylearning.com. Find me at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org. You can just put my name in there. I'm also on social media at Whole Family Learning on Facebook and Instagram, and on Twitter at Kerry, Kerry _edu.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. Let me stop the recording and then we'll get you going on your way.
Thanks so much, Dustin.